Well, thank you for that generous introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I'd like to follow from my colleague Jill Nichols earlier this morning in welcoming you here to Salford. Particular welcome to my colleagues from the University of Salford, and thank you and congratulations on developing such an important and significant conference. Welcome to colleagues from other universities, both in the northwest and the west of the UK. And a lot of what I want to talk about this morning is about building networks. And so it's a pleasure to see you here. And also to our international guests. I don't quite know what it is about Salford that's attracting people from Australia, but clearly we've got something going for us here on this side of the Irwell. And also to my fellow citizens of the great continent of Africa. It's always a pleasure to see work from Africa working in with the sorts of themes of conferences such as this. I can certainly identify with some of Sue's points there, such as intellectual vulnerability. And I certainly feel a degree of intellectual vulnerability here, because what I've also discovered is Vice-Chancellors don't have freedom of expression. Every word is interpreted as indicating some sort of imminent policy shift or something like that. So my talk to some extent comes with a health warning in that respect, and that is that I might have some great ideas here, but it's not at all clear that the Director of Finance is going to allow me to do them. So let's put that before you all email me and say, yes, you said, and now what about some resource? Let's just remember that. So I'm treating this as an academic conference, which of course is the heart of what we're about in universities, and it's meetings such as these that are essential to our intellectual life. I'm going to speak to the presentation that I've been prepared. I mean, its written form will be posted either on your resource, your website or whatever. It's a little long, and I don't want to embarrass my hosts by them feeling that they can't stop me speaking when I overrun my time, or to have all of you worrying about when you're going to get your coffee break. So I'm not going to read the whole of it, but the substance of it will be there. And my obsession in this, as you can see, is with the iconic figure of Mickey Mouse. And you'll see why as I develop my argument. But it's a point of reflection that Mickey Mouse turns 80 this year. You wouldn't know it if you looked at him, remarkably well preserved. And it runs the sort of theme of what I want to talk about, which is fundamentally the case for open access in universities, open access of information, and our obligation and our duty as institutions in that regard, but also, as I hope to demonstrate, recognition that the essence of what we do depends on open access to information, because that's what intellectual and academic life is all about. But let me start off then by setting up a bit of a straw target, because these are always useful rhetorical devices. And the straw target I want to set up is that of a closed system. I mean, what do closed information systems look like? Well, of course, closed information systems are fundamentally based on the notion of intellectual property being the equivalent of other forms of property. The notion that intellectual property is the equivalent of physical property that is owned by some sort of title, and therefore, of course, can be traded or alienated as a result of that, and can, in fact, to go back to classic economic theory, can be a source of achieving rent. It's a rent-seeking resource. And that's been with us for a long time, of course, notably from the Bale-Doyle Acts of the early 1980s, of 1980, but then particularly, of course, from the Thatcher government cuts of the early 1980s onwards, and that drive towards universities moving into the area of generating revenues. And I should remind us here at the University of Salford that, in fact, overnight in 1981, the University of Salford found over 40% of its resources removed by central government, which turned out to be quite good for us, actually, because we had to reinvent ourselves. But let's just hope in the present gloom about public finances, we don't wake up one morning to find a similar circumstance upon us. So the idea of intellectual property or physical property, the best models of this, as we all recognize, are the great pharmaceutical companies that rose in the past of the last century. And any of those of you who've been involved in them, and I think some of our colleagues here from the areas of the health professions would be more than aware of this, of course. These are massive machines that hire very significant numbers of people and control intellectual property to the point that if you ever visit one of their campuses, which I have, you will probably literally be frisked as you leave the premises to make sure you haven't taken anything with you. And they hire armies of lawyers to control their access to their intellectual property. And what happens, and if you teach innovation, which I have, you have this concept of an innovation funnel, which is a massive number of ideas, usually and typically in classic pharmaceutical companies, something like 3,000 to 4,000 patents, which only generate 5 or 6 commercial projects at the end of that intellectual funnel. And how they work in the classic closed system model is to patent absolutely everything as a defensive mechanism. So you'll find that a big firm like Schering-Plough, for example, or Pfizer, will at any one time own something like 5 to 6 to 10,000 patents, but will only ever produce 5 or 6 products as a result of them, and they'll defend that legally. And those are the classic sort of closed systems. The slightly alarming point for those of us in the cultural industries, and this is the point of the connection with Mickey Mouse, is, of course, the Disney Corporation operates in exactly the same way. And, you know, the classic nightmare now, never go into the area of film production. It must be a complete horror story because, of course, you've got to watch very carefully that everything that appears on your set is duly licensed as the intellectual property of somebody else. And the point of my sort of Mickey Mouse theme throughout this, of course, is don't you ever dare to use the image of Mickey Mouse without paying a license fee for the Disney Corporation, because somebody will come after you and sue you for doing that. And that is the rent-seeking activity of those images, and that's the classic of the closed system and the eternal Mickey Mouse. The idea then that every intellectual construct that takes an external form can be ascribed ownership that is equivalent of the ownership to a table, a chair, a vase, or something like that. Now, we've seen this, of course, in the music industry, quite famously, and we've seen how it can be very effectively subverted in the music industry. But I think as academics, we've probably all also experienced this in our own lives. I mean, I was amazed very recently, and I thought I'd seen everything, where having slaved over a paper that I was particularly proud of, and having had it accepted for an international journal for publication, I had a happy note from the publisher inviting me to pay $3,000 for the privilege of being able to distribute the PDF of my own paper free to anybody I wish to for the rest of my life. Now, as a moment's reflection on this, the company didn't pay me to do the research. They didn't pay me for the paper. The colleagues who sat on the editorial committee peer reviewing my paper weren't paid to peer review my paper. None of us were paid for anything. But here I am now being charged by the company $3,000 for the privilege of distributing my own work to my colleagues. And of course, famously, and I think quite rightly, we've all worried a great deal, and particularly those of us in administration worry a great deal about the fact that the cost of our journal subscriptions in our libraries seem to escalate at 2 to 3 times the general cost of consumer inflation in any one year. And what we're seeing there is a quite sophisticated system that takes public funds coming through our universities and translates them into shareholder benefit. Now, we wouldn't tolerate that in most areas of our lives as taxpayers, unless, of course, we were enthusiasts for the nationalisation of the British rail system and other sort of great exercises in transferring public property into private ownership. And those are somewhat notorious now for their consequences. But we as academics do tolerate that system whereby we alienate our intellectual property into closed systems. So what we've seen then is a situation where over the past 30 or so years, both in the US and here from the 1980s and elsewhere as well, we've seen a gathering momentum towards these closed systems in which we are constantly encouraged to privatize the results of our research and generate third stream income for our universities. And I'll come back onto third stream income a little later. I think there's also been and I think it's also common cause, that there's been a parallel tendency in teaching provision. The tendency to look, well, first of all, there's an underlying intellectual tendency which we're always familiar with, which has become very prevalent. And it's very prevalent at the moment in the emerging public debate about whether the cap should be lifted on tuition fees in this country. but it's also prevalent in the debate in Australia and the United States about the cost of education. And what we've seen is arguments that justify fees for education that are presented in terms of the return on investment in lifetime earnings for graduates. And you've all seen these sorts of arguments. So in other words, indebtedness, currently indebtedness for students in this country will run to about £20,000 to £25,000. I think there's a real prospect of that going up to about £50,000 for next year onwards, even with a modest lift on the cap. The argument basically is that your £50,000 that you're investing, you will get back many times over in your lifetime earnings. And of course, it is true that graduates earn significantly more than people who are not graduates. The problems with that argument, of course, is the perverse consequences that follow from it. The most extreme example that I've come of in that case is the case of law in the United States, which was highlighted by Harvard University's decision to, in fact, forgive the indebtedness of every Harvard law graduate who elected to go into public service. And the reason for that was the level of indebtedness of graduates in law coming out of American universities was so high that they couldn't afford to take legal jobs in the public sector. They had to go into high-paying practices to get that return back. And what was happening was that the public sector, which is vital in American law, was being denied good lawyers to work in the public sector, even though they wanted to, because they couldn't afford to. And so the problem with that argument, which is a tendency that we all have, that privatization argument, is creating all sorts of perverse consequences. My daughter's former boyfriend, and we all know how we feel about our daughter's boyfriends, but my daughter's former boyfriend, who's a young American who's passionate about becoming a vet, is now studying at a veterinary college in California. He's an American. My daughter lives in America. And he is contemplating leaving university when he graduates as a vet with $250,000 of personal debt. $250,000 of personal debt. Now that is a lot to recover on lifetime earnings. But we see a tendency of this in the privatization of teaching provision, in the argument about enrolling foreign students, and in some of the arguments that are being debated at the moment. And I think it's very relevant to us to remember this, because what we're going to see this autumn is an increasing momentum towards discussing the question of the cost of education and how it's recovered. And we're all confident that immediately after the election, neither major party's got an interest in making this an issue prior to the election, but we're going to see immediately after the election a significant move to, I think, shift the cost of education more onto our students than onto the public purse in one way or another. We were at the university. I was at the university's UK meeting in Edinburgh last week. I mean, I must say, 80 vice-chancellors together in a room is quite a scary prospect. I was proud of the fact that I was the only one not wearing a business suit, but that's another issue altogether. If you come from South Africa, you're allowed to wear South African national dress, which Nelson Mandela allowed us all to do. And I'm encouraging that tendency in the University of Salford. We all watched with great interest every single phrase that David Lammy issued at that conference to see if we could actually get some hint. And what I found interesting was hear a Labour minister talking about contestability, private contributions to funding, shifting this. Now, if a Labour minister's talking that way, I think it's a foregone conclusion that we're going to see that shift. So I think that that's what I'm arguing about I actually think it's a pity we're not finding a space to have a national debate about that issue, unentailed by party politics concern, because I think this is going to affect generations of our students for a very long time to come. And I think it's something that we need to step back from and ask what we're doing. Okay, so those are sort of closed systems approaches, I think. The tendency to privatize intellectual property, the tendency to see education as something that gets a return on investment, is all part of what I'm seeing as a general move towards this sort of Disney Corporation pharmaceutical model of the intellectual work that we do in universities. And what I want to go on to do is to argue that that's fundamentally flawed from an intellectual point of view, not because it's wrong from an ethical point of view, and it's a different issue and an important one, but simply because it doesn't work. And I want to make that argument in a minute. But first of all, of course, we need to recognize that I have actually set up a caricature, because I think that the idea that education is a market is actually an illusion. And despite the fact that we've now seen more than 30 years of that movement, there isn't really a true market in education at all. Now, I'm not a particular expert on US higher education, and some of you here are from the United States. But I do think it's common cause that the notion of there being a true market in education in the US is indeed an illusion. I mean, first of all, you've got the difference between the Ivy League universities with their significant endowments, now somewhat dented, where in fact they will use those endowments and have done famously. I mean, for a while, probably not now, Princeton University didn't actually have to charge any undergraduate any fee at all, because the return on their endowment and the size of the endowments of these American universities, if you put them in Africa, the size of Stanford, where Stanford has an economy bigger than 10 individual African nations. So you are looking at very, very significant economic organizations. They use their funds strategically. There isn't a true market. If they want a particular student, for instance, to make up the diversity of their class, and that student has the ability to succeed, they won't pay any tuition at Princeton or Harvard. And of course, when you look at the state system, there isn't a true market either. My daughter studied at the University of Massachusetts. She was a resident in the state of Massachusetts, so she paid a fraction of what a student would pay who wasn't a resident of the state of Massachusetts. So clearly there isn't an open market in education there. There clearly isn't an open market in the United Kingdom, because what happened with the introduction of so-called variable fees is they instantly ceased to be variable. Because everybody, with the famous exception of Leeds, went to the maximum very, very quickly, and Leeds has followed rather inevitably to that point. A very brave experiment on the part of Leeds to resist that trend. But everybody's gone up to the maximum they're charged. If the cap is lifted, as we all think it will be, to something around about £7,500, I think everybody's going to go pretty rapidly to £7,500 as well. And so again, it's not at all clear that the market drives that. It's also not at all clear, if you follow the logic of the closed system commercialization model, that people will pay more for quality. It doesn't necessarily make sense. If you want to get into the employment market, what you should really pay for is a university that passes you, not a university that fails you. So the market logic would say universities will seek the ASDA equivalence that will give them the cheapest possible defensible quality for their investment, not in fact be prepared to pay the highest possible fees. So there are all sorts of possible consequences there that we don't really know about. But the point is, of course, we don't really have a market. Probably the most salient and sobering observation, though, is that even if you look back over the last 30 years and you look at what's happened as a consequence of legislation in the United States and the UK, there is no university that actually makes more than 10% of its operating costs from third stream income. Even MIT, even Stanford. These are very important sources of income. They're huge economies. But if you look at their overall budgets and their overall operating accounts, they make about 8% of their overall operating from their third stream and licensing activities. They don't, in fact, underpin their basic economies from this. So this movement hasn't really worked. And I suppose the question that I really want to ask is why? Now, of course, the public discourse that we get on this as people in universities as to why we haven't succeeded in privatizing our education provision, in fact, telling our students that they should pay more for our courses, is because we are inefficient, willful, ivory tower type people who don't live in the real world, in which we're constantly reminded and told by ministers, by the now notorious Select Committee report on quality, and by virtually everything that anybody says. And people love saying that about us. I mean, I often wonder what an ivory tower actually is like, and I would personally love to live in one, and I'm sure many of you would. And I'm sure it doesn't feel like an ivory tower when you stagger to the bus at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning with the heap of marking that you've actually been doing through the entire weekend. And you probably yearn for an ivory tower and probably never have lived in one. I don't think it is due to the combination of inefficiency and willfulness on our part as academics, as teachers, as intellectual and researchers. I think that the reason for that is that as a type of organization, universities are actually precisely the opposite of pharmaceutical companies and the Disney Corporation. There are about 10,000 institutions in the world which roughly can be described as universities if you use a reasonable measure. And I think those 10,000 institutions have a very distinctive set of characteristics. And we know that they do in many respects because, as our international guests know, you can go into a university in the English-speaking world. It'll take you about half an hour to reorient yourself. You get used to the fact that the Americans call faculty one thing and we call faculty something else. And once you've got over those terminological difficulties, you can locate yourself pretty quickly. You know where sociology is, you know where education is, you know where anthropology is, you figure out the politics, you know what a Vice-Chancellor is and what he's likely to say, because they always say the same thing wherever they are. You know what a dean is, you know what a head of department is, and you know what a lecturer is. And you also certainly know what a student is. And that's because we all work in organizations that have similar characteristics. And I think that the fundamental reason for that difference, and the point, I think there are lots of reasons for looking at it, but the point that I want to emphasize today is that our business is actually not about closed systems. Our business is about giving our intellectual property away. That's what we do. That's what we're driven to do. We're not driven to keep it to ourselves. We're driven to give it away. And that's why we all find it so difficult, even if we're really willing to generate third stream income and all sorts of commercialized operations from it. So why is it that we want to do that? Thomas Jefferson had that answer a long time before the digital revolution. And in a famous quotation, he observed that knowledge is like a candle. He can have his candle lit, and many of the rest of you can light your candle from his candle, and his candle is still burning. And he made that distinction that intellectual life, intellectual property is not like other property. It has very other distinctive characteristics. And what universities have done from time immemorial, way before the digital revolution, is develop very sophisticated mechanisms for giving intellectual property away. That's what disciplines are. We all know what disciplines are a field of study. When I was a proper archaeologist and not a pretend archaeologist, which I am now, I was happiest with my other archaeologists at conferences where we all got together and we compared notes over coffee about how stupid the vice-chancellors of our universities were, because they didn't realize that the only discipline worth funding was archaeology. Okay? That's what you all do when you go to conferences. You meet colleagues who you very often identify more strongly with than with your own institution, because you work in fields of study where you have common professional practices, common language, common theoretical bases that you work from. That's what gives you your identity. And often that overrides your particular institutional affiliation, your institutional loyalties. And disciplines are very sophisticated mechanisms for giving away intellectual property. And of course, the other fundamental way in which we give away intellectual property is we wish our work to be cited, to be quoted, to be used by others. That's why we are so obsessed with plagiarism, because plagiarism is the true source of theft of our work. We want to be recognized by our peers. We want our work to be cited with respect. That's what drives us. So we want it to be given away. We don't want to keep it to ourselves like those poor individuals who work in the laboratories for big pharmaceutical companies like Schering-Plough, where they're not allowed to give it away. They're not even allowed to talk about it. We love talking about it. We want other people to cite it. And of course, conferences like this one are, again, sophisticated mechanisms to distribute knowledge openly. You all made an effort to come here, which we're delighted about, so you can hear each other's work. You can go away. You can quote it with respect, acknowledging the source that it came from. And these are very sophisticated mechanisms that we've developed through the years, and that's what universities are really about. So we have a massive knowledge system driven by the wish to give away knowledge. Now, why is that so important? And I think this is where Thomas Jefferson really had it right. The reason why it's so important is because of the nature of knowledge itself. Knowledge isn't like a table, a stool, a chair, a piece of property that you can sell. One of the reasons why is because knowledge can be claimed and used by many other people without being used up itself. If 1,000 people cite your work is still there. If you drive 1,000 miles in your car, the petrol is not there. It's gone, you've used it up. You don't use up your knowledge by it, in fact, it being quoted by others. What's more, the more it's quoted by others, the more you're likely to see these wonderful exponential effect type increases where people from different fields get together and have that wonderful moment of recognition where they realize that their work collides in ways that generate something that's greater than the parts. And we've seen that, of course, in the huge knowledge revolutions of our time. I mean, after all, sequencing DNA was made possible by the collision of digital approaches which came out of computer science and the biological sciences that followed their own route. And it was only really when those two big, powerful fields started getting together that we see the huge revolution in public health that gives us all, or not us, but our children's children, the hugely alarming prospect of living to the age of 150. But that's a different issue altogether. So my argument is that the nature of knowledge is quite unique. And that's what we're in. We're in the knowledge business. The knowledge business is not like ordinary business. The stuff we work with should be given away, should be made publicly available. And those are the sorts of institutions that we have and the particular qualities of knowledge that make it very different from other categories of phenomenon. So then my argument that I want to suggest to you is that even if we wanted to, closed systems of knowledge are unlikely to be successful, simply because they go against the grain of what it is that we do. A very useful model here, and I won't go into detail because I don't have that much time, but what I found useful in organizing my thoughts around this is this very interesting model of the tragedy of the commons, which some of you will have come across, which has stimulated in itself a very, very interesting literature into game theory and other areas. And the basic, for those of you not familiar with it, the metaphor that was used here quite productively, I think, was this rather charming romanticized notion of the village commons before enclosure. And the idea is that you've got a number of households around a village common. Each of them have the equivalent political status and standing in the village. And in the middle is common ground on which the cattle and the sheep are grazed. Now, it's very evident to everybody that if you continue grazing at the rate that you're grazing, you're going to destroy the commons and everybody loses because there'll be no more grazing. Everybody can see that. But the problem is that if you then act in a way that is not self-interested by removing your sheep, you work on the assumption that your neighbour will actually simply take your vacated grazing and do better than you. So your self-interest drives you not to vacate the commons, and the tragedy of the commons is everybody loses, even though everybody knows they're going to lose. Now, there are obvious analogies here in some of the sorts of big problems that we deal with in the world today. I mean, global climate warming could be one of them, for example. And the tragedy of commons debate has sparked a very interesting literature. But there's a counter-argument that in the paper I've suggested we could almost call the triumph of the commons. And interestingly enough, that is rooted in the sort of knowledge work that we all do. And of course, is fundamentally demonstrated by the extraordinary success of the open source movement in computer programming and in digital work. And the fact that we now have these massively successful open source directions, such as Linux, for instance, is a classic one, where literally tens of thousands of individuals, not driven by self-interest, actually collaborate to form this massively impressive operating system. And that critical and decisive moment in the history of business, when IBM, which was facing critical failure, made the decision to move from the closed system model to the open system model and put everything on a Linux base, and to derive value for that is, of course, one of the great stories of the history of business and industry. So what I'm calling the triumph of the commons is that when we turn to forms of knowledge, we find quite the opposite of that metaphor. And the potential that we have in the future is to use that to really develop to our benefit. Why then is it that we should really look at this as a source of alternative for the way that we operate? Well, first of all, I think we have to, because it speaks, as I've been saying throughout this talk, to the fundamental idea of what a university actually is. But I also think it's imperative on us for the simple reason that a lot of the challenges that we face now and into the future are simply too complex to be solved by old methodologies. Now, I'm a great enthusiast of Bruno Latour's work because I think his work is a very, very good way of describing what we actually do in terms of circulating reference systems and the way that we actually work in developing models. But in a provocative essay, Latour asks the question whether we've actually ever been modern. And what he does in framing that question, he's easily misunderstood, and Latour has, of course, been misrepresented as an enemy of science. And if you really read his work, of course, that's not the case at all. He's essentially an ethnographer of science. But Latour's argument is that what we can call the science settlement, which are really the great developments of our universities since the Enlightenment and onwards, have been successful because the problems, although they're very important, have been relatively contained in scale. So the classic success of science, and of course the social sciences, are problems that can be phrased in a bounded way and studied, classically, say, in a single laboratory. So the great breakthroughs in science, you know, the really gifted science team, Crick and Watson working together in a single laboratory in Cambridge, crack the code for DNA. That's the classic closed science model, and it's been hugely successful in our time. It's what's given us modern medicine, huge technological breakthroughs, the internet itself, and everything else that we work with. Latour's argument is that we're moving into an age where the current problems that we have are too complicated to be dealt with in that way. And I think if we think about it, we can all think of classic examples of that. I mean, a classic one, and I've mentioned it already, of course, is the challenge of dealing with global warming. Now, if you talk to the climate scientists, they now have enough data to tell you quite precisely what's wrong and quite precisely what's going to happen, and it's very scary. But that hasn't led us to solving the problem because it hasn't produced a solution to the really complicated political problems that lay behind doing something about that. Now, any of us who've got an interest in Africa will be particularly interested in this issue because, of course, in terms of global warming, it's going to be continents like Africa that are hit the absolute hardest. Just to give you an idea, if global warming goes above 2 degrees centigrade, which is now almost certain, and gets to about 3 degrees of centigrade, the whole country of Botswana disappears under the Kalahari Desert. Gone. Okay? I mean, that's an issue of some very considerable concern. Now, it might not be an issue in Salford, because the issue in Salford will be a rise in the River Irwell to the point that a lot of low-lying areas will be inundated. There's a certain commonality if you look at who it is who lives in the low-lying areas around the valley of the River Irwell, and exactly whose houses are going to be destroyed by that sort of global climate change. And the problem with the global climate change piece is that you're trying to put together intense local interests that obviously concern people in Botswana or in Greater Manchester, with a very complicated piece of science, which is sometimes quite difficult to explain, with some really hair-raising politics, which basically involve a situation of the Americans going to Kyoto and telling the Indians, you've got to stop your development. You can't have any further development because of global warming, and having the Indians turn around and say, yes, that's all right, you're driving your Hummers all around Washington. We basically are dealing with massive child mortality. And nobody's got their minds around the politics of those settlements. So global warming defies the individual disciplines. There are other examples, I think, that are equally intractable. The discipline of economics, profoundly successful, you know, hugely impressive in terms of the range of fields. But I've recently been to one of those wonderful conferences, which is rather happens what I'm going to do to you shortly, which is where the guest speaker comes in, gives his or her speech, takes a couple of questions and then leaves. And I went to one quite recently where I didn't leave. I stayed the whole 3 days, and we had 3 different people, national and international experts, coming in to explain the financial meltdown that's put us into recession. And the fascinating thing is every one of them gave a totally different explanation, diametrically opposed. Unfortunately, they didn't stay for each other, so they didn't hear it. But literally, one expert came up from London and said, there's nothing new in this recession. It's exactly like all previous recessions. It's all hype. And the next speaker came in and said, this recession's totally unique. We've never seen anything like it. And they were both fully qualified economists. Okay? A bit scary, really, particularly if you're worrying about your little savings and your pension plan. But the point I'm trying to make here is spectacularly, economics as a discipline has yet to explain fully what actually happened to our financial systems, or in fact to provide the sort of predictive science that helps us understand what should actually be done in the future. And again, I think that's a field-level intellectual problem that can't be solved within a single sort of discipline. There are others, you know, that are really closer to home. I mean, I have been, you know, in getting to know Salford as a really great place to be, I've been enthralled and appalled and this comes as an archaeologist with an interest in the physical traces things, by the physical and continuing remnants of failed urban regeneration schemes here in the city of Salford. I mean, I went to a fascinating exhibition over the weekend called Retracing Salford, which was down in the Chapel Street Gallery. And a project there called Lost Streets is working with communities to regain information on the streets that have been destroyed in Salford. The stunning thing is over 1,500 streets have been destroyed in the past 50 years, with all the houses on them, and the loss of all of those memories. You go around Salford today, perfectly good houses under compulsory purchase orders, boarded up with nobody living in them, and the roof disappearing steadily as people steal the slates. Nothing wrong with the houses. They were repossessed over now failed urban regeneration schemes. So if you look at the city of Salford, you've had 50 years of successive failures in urban regeneration. And yet, and this is not meant as a criticism, we have a school of the built environment that we would claim is one of the best in the 5 in the country, and academic expertise to address these sorts of issues. Again, as local problems, these seem to defy easy discipline field type solutions. They have this need to look more outwards. And my argument is, again, as to why it is we have to look at open system type approaches, is because the problems as academics that we are called upon to address, and I think the general field of education is a classic one in this sense, because none of us can really find the magic bullet solution to why schools fail, for example, and why education systems throughout the world are having huge difficulties in some of the classic disciplines of literacy and mathematics. We are faced with these huge field problems that defy these closed system approaches. If we went to what I've called throughout this talk the Mickey Mouse model, of the closed model, and we emulated the closed systems of the drug companies, and we started restricting our knowledge on a fee-paying basis so that we wouldn't share it with each other unless we were getting a royalty on the ideas that we're talking about, how would we ever create the open networks of engagement which would allow us to find these connections across the field? So there are huge new possibilities, I think, in dealing with these big problems of today. I'm going to stop at that point. I have addressed in the paper, for those of you who are interested, the very evident and immediate question is, if we had open systems, how would we fund them? And I have actually addressed that because I've got some ideas on that. But I think I'll leave it at that point. Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate it.